particularly to Ayse Caglar to be with us, even if it is not possible to be in person. I think we appreciate for different strands, because this seminar is open to everybody that wanted to attend, and that's been our master students firstly, because it is a compulsory teaching for them, but also in our department of political science and all the other masters and PhD students that are also involved in a postgraduate program. Also, EBEI. EBEI is an international relation master that is very close to us in the same building, and we usually organize a lecture, but across the two masters. And I welcome also students from EBEI particularly. And I learned from you that maybe some other students from your postgraduate will be there also, and then this is a quite international or transnational seminar, and I welcome them also. I think that Juan Carlos will explain better what will be the content and the logistic of this seminar, particularly the ways of participation, which is maybe so particular because we cannot do that in person. And but I am sure that Juan Carlos will explain everything just before your lecture. Thank you, Ayse Caglar, to be there, and hopefully we will have time to have a conversation after you talk, and also to meet you in person. I am sure this will be done in one way or another in the near future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ricard, for your words and introduction. And hi, everyone, and welcome to this research forum, which is organized by GRITIM-UPF in the framework of the EuroMedMig initiative and the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. I would like to thank Ayse for her presence here, for accepting to participate and to share her knowledge with us. We are very grateful for it. And as Ricard said, one of the particularities of doing this webinar is the participation, the Q&A session afterwards, which is the system only allows written questions. Then what I will do is that I will read the questions to Ayse, and she will respond after. So the title of Professor Caglar's presentation is Migrants, Coloniality of Power and Temporal Framework. And let me spend some words on Professor Caglar. She's a university professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Science. Her work focuses on the conceptualization of the location of migrants in city-making processes and urban politics. Her comparative empirical work particularly focuses on mostly deindustrialized, depopulated cities which had lost their power. Professor Caglar has widely published on the processes of migration, urban restructuring, dispossession, and displacement, as well as the entanglements between states and transnationalization processes. In addition to several journal articles, Professor Caglar has edited Urban Protests, Revolt in the Neoliberal State in German, co-author Migrants and City-Making, Dispossession, Displacement, and Urban Regeneration, and co-edited Located Migration, Rescaling Cities and Migrants. And with this short introduction, without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Caglar to start her presentation. And again, thank you very much for being here. I will now share my screen. So please, 1 second. I think that, yes, I think that you should see it now. Yes.
Okay. And first of all, just a minute, I see something I have to have. Okay. I have a problem here, but doesn't matter. I think I could solve it. Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to share my work with you. It is partly overlaps with some of the material that I had published, but also in scattered ways, and then it brings some of the material together. I think I have like 45 minutes to talk, and 45 to 50 minutes that you said. So let me just try to open this. Okay, this does not work that way. Okay, let me start. So with the first slide, you could just simply move on to the first slide. Johan, could you? Yes. I would like to start my my talk with a provocative assertion that methodological nationalism and its ethnic lands still remain entrenched in multifarious ways in migration and refugee studies. Among their other shortcomings, they prevent us seeing the commonalities between groups of people, migrant and non-migrant alike, by inscribing them into different spatio-temporal, institutional, and policy frames. These frames hinder us analyzing migrants, refugees' practices, subjectivities, and relations with the quote-unquote others in connection to the contemporary dynamics of the now. I will come to that later. They are all subject. In my talk, I will focus on these spatio-temporal impediments of I will explain those ones. I will focus on those impediments. By methodological nationalism, although it has been written quite a lot on that, but still to refresh our memory, I am referring to the reification of the nation state as the self-evident container of political, cultural, and economic relations and processes, where the related ethnic lands, which is ethnic lands is very much connected to the methodological nationalism, obscures, in the case of migration studies, the diversity of migrants' relationship to their settlement, to other localities around the world, as well as the commonalities between groups of people sorted into different categories as migrants or as native, but also in various different categories. This is not the only binary. Though methodological nationalism unfolds in several ways, it often finds its way into our work through the units of analysis and the categories we adopt and reuse. So the second slide, please. And the second slide. Okay. Almost 2 decades after the critique of various critiques of actually methodological nationalism in migration scholarship, I think we could easily say that methodological nationalism is pretty resilient, and the simple shift of our units of analysis to the subnational, to the local, the city, neighborhood, to household does not provide us a facile way out. Instead, we need to find ways in our work to overcome the deep-seated spatial and temporal blinders of methodological nationalism, which are very much anchored in the categories we operate with. I'm underlining this because of this, it's very often now that the flagging out the local, flagging out the city, or the taking the neighborhood as the unit of analysis is not simply a kind of a remedy that will not, as a kind of, it will not protect us falling into methodological nationalism. For this reason, and I think that in order to find how it really gets through our work and finds life in our work, we really have to look at the spatial and temporal frames that we are operating with in migration studies. For this reason, in my talk, I will first focus very briefly on the spatial impediments, and for this purpose, concentrate on the discontents of mobility-based frameworks that dominate migration studies. Then I will move to the question of temporality and space-time relations in migration processes and how they are approached in migration scholarship. Here I will particularly concentrate on the questions of the so-called multiple and discrepant temporalities that are thought to characterize the experiences and practices of migrants and refugees. I argue that these spatial and temporal frames are closely related to the racialized, culturalized logics of capitalism that play a crucial role in shaping the value regimes and the governance structures within which migrants are embedded in. The third slide, please. My suggestion is simple. In order to move beyond the grip of methodological nationalism, we need a new analytical vocabulary that will allow us to move beyond different kinds of binaries between different kinds of divides between migrants and those who are considered to be non-migrants. And here I build upon our work with Nina Glick-Schiller that Johan kindly referred to, where we have called for a new analytical lens in our several writings, but also our 2018 book, Migrants and City Making. We called for a new analytical lens so that it would enable us to capture how residents of a place participate in multiple ways in the processes and struggles of placemaking. Second, to approach the inequalities and disparities in relation to the dispossessive processes of displacement underlying wealth generation through, because of my topic, I refer to urban redevelopment. But it is basically looking at the processes of dispossessive processes and disparities and displacements that are underlying the wealth generation or accumulation of capital. Third, to capture the interdependencies among these processes, as well as the common conditions of precarity and displacement, which mark the lives of many residents of that place, which are very often the urban residents, which are often glossed over by urban development narratives. Here I refer to the residents of the place beyond a a priori categorical divide, such as migrants, IDPs, refugees, and the poor. So trying to find an analytical vocabulary where we could see, which will enable us to connect several key processes, but also to be able to see certain commonalities rather than the differences. This does not mean that we have to erase the differences, but trying to see the kind of the commonalities. So next slide, please. What are the building blocks of this vocabulary? First one is the concept. One is the concept of displacement rather than mobility. Let me make a kind of a caveat about the benefits of exploring migrants and city making through the lens of displacement, dispossession, rather than through the lens of mobility. You could read it as not necessarily city making here, but also place making. So why I think that it is more beneficial to look at as, rather than using the concept of mobility, use the concept of displacement. Yes, I am very much aware that there have been calls to shift our analytical vocabulary from migration to mobility in order to be able to address the autonomy of migration, like the Geneva or Mazadra had argued for, and to acknowledge the agency of migrants. However, despite the importance of highlighting migrants' agency in their acts of mobility, I think there is an important argument there, but still, one of the main problems of giving mobility a central stage in defining and analyzing migration and migrants' lives and practices is that mobility is a concept closely related to the national order of things. The nation state often occupies a central role in defining and institutionalizing what counts as mobility and what kinds of mobilities are rendered invisible. We know that not every mobile person is designated as a migrant, and there are many people designated as migrants who had not moved from anywhere to anywhere. Thus, the selectivity of the mobility lens is very much embedded within the political regimes of nation states, which is very much shaped by the power dynamics of a given historical conjuncture. So it is, for example, it is the nation state space which gives centrality to the conceptualization of a particular kind of, namely cross-border mobility, as foundational, that it overshadows all other mobilities or immobilities of people designated as migrants. This overshadowing is very clear once we think of the people displaced within the nation state or simply the rural-urban migrants. This overshadowing is the result of, I think, seeing like a state through the lens of a national order of the world. So yes, there is a merit in terms of finding the agency in the act of mobility, but mobility is not a it is not a concept without problems. Furthermore, I think a framework which inscribes mobility as the most defining characteristics of migrants' livelihood hinders us to see and explore the spatial immobilities which are crucial aspects of migrant lives. Migrants' lives are not simply composed of the mobilities. Thus, we neither capture all spatial dislocations nor the immobilities that are central to migrants' experiences and to migration processes through a mobility-centered lens of migration. The next slide, please. I argue that the concept of displacement instead allows us to shed light on series of interrelated processes which are obscured by the concept of mobility, in addition to the issues that I referred to that seem like a state, and it's very much anchored in the state regimes. By shifting to the concept of displacement, we can frame population movements in relation to other processes, namely of dispossessions resulting from appropriations, but also from the erosion of livelihood. And while the concept of mobility does not necessarily connect the processes underlying migration to other, the concept of displacement enables us to do so and situate migration in relation to other key processes of capital accumulation and restructuring and the resulting dispossessions and dislocations. While a conceptual network centered around the process of accumulation, dispossession, and displacement allows us to address the processes of wealth generation through restructuring, inequalities, and migrant emplacement in interrelationship to each other. So while the concept of mobility disconnects these processes or rather forces us to really focus on the action of mobility, the concept of displacement enables us to connect and situate them within a broader field of power. And in this way, we could see and analyze how seemingly independent processes, but also locations, as well as institutions of varying scale, are intimately interconnected with each other. Our conceptual network not only determines what we reveal and what we obscure, but also the semantics of dividing, thinking about difference, connections, and domains of commonalities and sociabilities among the residents of a place. But both migrants and non-migrants are subject to the process of displacement and dispossession within the capital and particularly urban restructuring dynamics in cities, and a conceptual network anchored in accumulation, dispossession, and displacement allows us to address the processes of wealth generation through restructuring and migrant settlement in relation to in interrelationship to each other. The second concept, once we talk about that, instead of mobility bringing that, the displacement, which could allow us to look at it in terms of their commonalities, the second concept, which is central to the analytical framework we are proposing, is emplacement. And we defined emplacement in our book as you see the quotation, the relationship between the continuing restructuring of place within multiscalar networks of power and a person's efforts within the barriers and opportunities that contingencies of local placemaking offer to build a life within networks of local, national, supranational, and global interconnections. In a way, this means approaching the lives and practices of migrants and their social reproduction within the multiscalar analysis opportunity structures in hand. I know that there are political scientists listening, and this is not simply taking the opportunity structure, but looking at a multiscalar analysis of the opportunity structures. It always directs us to the power geometry of the forces active in the now of a given space and time. Emplacement is a processual concept which allows us to situate all residents of a place within transformations of space over time by linking space, place, and power. We have talked about the concept of emplacement more in depth in our book. Here, I think it is important to underline that unlike the term of integration, the concept of emplacement both invokes a sense of placemaking and allows us to focus on a set of experiences and constraints shared by people who are generally differentiated by scholars and policy makers into very different categories, but also as migrants or natives. By speaking of emplacement, we can frame migrant and quote-unquote non-migrant displacement within the locally and temporally situated processes of destruction and reconstitution of capital. Forms and processes of generation of wealth and the restructuring of capital are central to the concept. So it is not simply the concept of emplacement is not simply a new fad word for integration or kind of for incorporation. I'm underlining this because I'm seeing it more and more. It is not simply really a new word for integration because this concept does not make sense without its connections to the key processes of regimes of value creation. The second slide, please. Okay. This conceptual network enables us to move beyond some barriers engraved into research and the categories of governance and policies. It enables us to approach the dynamics of migration and those who see themselves as natives in placemaking within the same analytical framework, that is, without inscribing them into different spaces and times in analyzing their practices and relations. In this way, we could address the common conditions of precarity and vulnerability and displacement. For example, many urban residents are subject to beyond the usual divides of migrants, refugees, IDPs, and the poor. What is important here is situating migrants as contemporaries in the same now of all other inhabitants of that place. So as you could see from the beginning, I'm trying to find a kind of a common analytical lens where we could talk about commonalities and where we could try to see, the people who are sorted out into different categories as operating in the same now, being subject to, although differentially, but in principle, the same forces. So it is trying to approach them as being subjects to the configuration of social forces at a particular conjuncture rather than of their path-dependent pasts or cultural, religious dynamics or dynamics of power. This implies that we need to analyze their practices as coeval, that all inhabitants of a place, migrant or not migrant, or into which category they are inscribed into, to build their lives within processes of displacement and emplacement that are enabled and shaped by value regimes embedded in the power geometry of that historical conjuncture. I think this should be our starting point, and we need to have a kind of a framework, a vocabulary that will enable us to see the, to locate the migrants or the refugees as at a coeval, as coeval to the other inhabitants of that place. Once we do this, we might see that the categorical differences very often used in the analysis might not be the most relevant ones in understanding the livelihood, practices, and subjectivities of the people inscribed into different categories. In this way, we might start seeing, of course, as I said, without erasing the differences, the convergences of the practices, precarity, vulnerabilities, but also the commonalities of the governance structures of the poor, the migrant, refugee, and the displaced people, be internally or otherwise. Such an analytical vocabulary actually opens us also ways to address the racializing logics that facilitate and legitimate dispossessions and structures of participation to the public and political life, namely the coloniality of power. So next slide, please. Okay. Coloniality of power refers to how the legitimizing narratives of racialized, culturalized, and gendered differences are fundamental to the appropriation and the dispossessive processes underlying capital accumulation. This is, we could look at it to Butler, we could look to Quijano, Piketty. That is, it is not about that the kind of the differences, but how the differences are brought into racialized logic, meaning that creating kind of hierarchies which are crucial, fundamental for any kind of legitimizing the appropriations and the dispossessive processes. Those who understand capital also to be a set of unequal social relations, so capital is a social relationship, rightly urge us to analyze both processes in relationship to each other. It is about how differences, distinctions are racialized despite their detachment from visible markers of race and skin color. So I use this concept in reference to the epistemologies of racial hierarchies embedded in knowledge production and governance, which play an important role in the constitution of migrants, refugees as the dispossessed, often as the worthless, as subjects, but also as dispossessed labor, but also worthless subjects. Though the scholars of migration, border, and refugee studies increasingly pay more attention to the concept of coloniality of power, I think a rather narrow approach to it dominates these studies. So we are seeing that the people started talking about coloniality of power in relation to migration. Once the coloniality of power is about the devaluation and dehumanized production of migrant, refugee, labor, or subject as worthless, it is more easily recognized. The coloniality of power is actually, in a way, very much inscribed into that territory, that conceptual territory. However, once these constructed differences take the form of a positive valuation, as it is case in the narratives of diversity, these valorizations are often approached as if they were detached from the structures and processes of dispossessions underlying capital accumulation. Very often these processes are not framed as part of the workings of the coloniality of power. So building upon this broader understanding of coloniality, I argue that we need to approach both to the devaluation of migrants, refugees, and the striking valorization of different groups, which could very well be also migrants, refugees, or the minorities, and their concomitant quote-unquote empowerment, both discursively and in policies, as part of capital restructuring and urban restructuring, because of in relation to the work that I'm talking now and all the examples I could give from there, restructuring geared towards contributing to the competitive worth of the place. This is a call for situating both the devalorization and the valorization processes, especially of marginalized groups, within a common analytical lens. This includes, as I said, their persecution, displacement, and dispossession, that through which they are made worthless, but as well as their revaluation made a value as assets, for example, as linguistic and religious diversity, or simply as sometimes in the policies as the disadvantage. We could get into some kinds of examples in the discussion. So coloniality of power is part of regimes of value that are connected to global movement of capital accumulation and its temporalities. In that sense, it is embedded into the logic of capitalism. Capitalism actually, value creation and capital accumulation operates through differences, but these differences actually, this is where that the, how those differences could be connected to the hierarchies. However, in order to capture the coloniality of power, it is crucial that we analyze these processes in relation to the changing mix and potency of intersecting multicultural networks of disparate power. That is to say, the historical conjuncture is crucial in, and when I'm talking about the historical conjuncture, I'm talking about the power geometry of the now, is crucial in understanding the temporality of value regimes. Because we know that if that the coloniality of power, and then these are kinds of these racialized differences are part of it all the time, but then if we are looking at the dynamics of revaluation and devaluation, and then we need to look at it within the particular temporality of value regimes. In short, I think a perspective using the coloniality of power lens helps us to situate the narratives, policies, and the scholarship on diversity, which migration studies have never shortage of, within the same analytical framework of exploring the processes of wealth generation, of capital accumulation, and of the concomitant dispossessions and displacements. And I think it is important to think both streams of scholarship and dynamics, actually, scholarship focusing on both different kinds of differently sorted out dynamics within the common analytical lens. And we know that people who work on the kind of the generational wealth and then the capital accumulation and then how those racial hierarchies work actually do not very much talk to the people who are working on the diversities and the merits of the diversities in places, in placemaking. So trying to bring them into a common analytical lens. Next slide, please. I think here it is important to note that the broader context of the strategies and the policies I'm referring to here is neoliberal city making in its various forms and shades, which are geared towards generating wealth by revitalizing the city, by making the city entrepreneurial. I'm looking at it, I mean, it is a general kind of a theory of a legality, but because of the research and because of the peculiarities also in terms of the city's location in the neoliberal policies and formations, this is the area, this is the location from which I am talking. This is the context in which places, but particularly cities, increasingly unleash themselves as engines of economy, centers of trade, investment, and innovation from the federal and national state. And this unleashing, related with the restructuring of capital, is part of the changing configurations of the relations between state, local power, and governance. This unleashing, I use the neoliberal in kind of quotation marks, not to use it as just a kind of a template. This unleashing could take several forms and intensity, and with a very different mix of the state and the local power and their governance. But in whatever form it takes, these dynamics alter the value regimes in those places. And here I'm referring to the cities. All place-based resources acquire a new value within the places. Competition to reach out global, regional, state, non-state, and supranational institutions and their funds to attract capital investment to the places. In this broader context of endless efforts to alter the multiscalar connectedness of the city, different segments of city population, places, practices, built environment, histories acquire value once they become assets for capital accumulation in the case of cities through urban regeneration. In other words, in our work, we showed how such kind of culturalized, racialized logics were part of the processes of both the devaluation and later revaluing of the same minority group, which was very much entangled with the envisaged capital accumulation in the particular city we studied at that time. Thus, the revaluing processes of those who were demonized before came to be embedded into a multiscalar field of powerful actors of varying scale that made their religious and linguistic differences of a value. This was also closely connected to the dynamics of regenerating wealth by attracting capital to the place at a particular time. So they were the most devalued and they became revalued. Most importantly, this went hand in hand with the process of dehumanization of making another segment of the population worthless and creating dispossessed labor. So it is not only, it is not monolithic, or unified kind of reevaluation and demonization and valorization. In this particular case of a city in Turkey to Syrian border, while the internally displaced Kurds were produced as workless labor, at the same time the Syriac Christian minority returnees and who were demonized before became valorized. And Kurds were made worthless and devalued as the labor force, and Syriacs as cultural, religious diversity. But this process of this looking at it as a kind of a value regime was all going simultaneously, and it was part of the same process of accumulation working through the coloniality of power. So this is what I am referring to in terms of those hierarchies and devalorization and revalorization working the face of the same process. Maybe we could move to the next slide. I have to check the time. Okay. Now, I would like to move to temporal frameworks. Temporality is a crucial but insufficiently discussed topic in migration studies. Recently, there has been an increasing number of studies on the temporal features related to migration, focusing on how migrants experience time, how time matters from the perspective of the state in regulating, controlling, and governing migrants through visas and a plethora of permits. In most cases, there is a strong focus on the hermeneutics and semiotics of time and an attempt to theorize the different temporal frames of migrants, refugees' experiences and their consequences. Time and refugees, with a particular focus on refugees' discordant sense of temporalities, quote unquote, is one of such topics. These are all important, but the emphasis on multiple temporalities of refugees as such might have some shortcomings. Such a focus on times of migrants and migration might very well lead to the essentialization of migrants by inscribing them to a topos of different, distinct experience of time. Such an inscription separates migrants and refugees a priori as a category, their experiences outside of those who are non-refugee, non-migrant. Those who warn us against this tendency argue that time, like space, should be seen as a constitutive element of every social practice and not only migrant social life. And if we're talking about the multiplicity of times, this is the case for everyone in society. So there is no sui generis temporal experience that is not and cannot be shared by other people, the non-migrants. Thus, neither experiencing time in this way, nor being subject to multiple temporalities are specific to migrants and refugees. Like the transnational ties and connections, multiple belongingness, being subject to multiple temporalities are not in the monopoly of migrants. If we think that this is only happening by the migrants, I think it is misleading. The other face of inscribing a priori different temporal features onto migrants, refugees, IDPs, distinct from non-migrants, is the temporal assumptions implicit in the categories we use in migration scholarship in framing the lives and practices of these people. As I wrote elsewhere, and I think I shared with the students of that article, in migration scholarship, different approaches to migrant settlement processes, such as integration, multiculturalist, transnational, and post-migrant, all situate migrants in time in distinctive ways and operate with different kinds of temporal regimes in conceptualizing migrants' dynamics, subjectivities, and sociabilities. Here I find Bakhtin's concept of chronotopes useful to explore how migrants and their practices could be conceptualized in connection to space and time in varying ways. As matrices, these chronotopes refer to a set of connections between time and space by which movement in space can be figured as a movement in time and vice versa. In fact, all approaches to migration are informed by such specific frames which situate migrancy, dynamics of migrant practices, and relations in connections to space and time. For example, framing migrants through an integration perspective means situating them in a linear and a sequential process. Migrants are expected to uproot themselves from the spaces of their home countries, of the culture which is projected to the ancestral home, and integrate themselves into the places of settlement in time. So that is actually, when we are saying that we are looking in the process, actually we're looking at this process from this spatial and temporal relationship. The theories and policies based on the concept of integration, no matter how sophisticated and revised they are all informed by those kind of temporal norms. And I think within that versions, I think there is no life after, outside of those temporal norms. The present of migrants is viewed and evaluated from the point of view of the temporal predicament, which refers to an ideal state of full integration. This is the basis of the teleology involved in most of the migration theories and models. I don't think that I need to repeat this to this group. This integrating migrant can never fully embrace the ideal, quote-unquote, host society, as she or he is in perpetual state of integrating. The present becomes, and this is why I'm talking about these things, because I'm trying to see how the present is conceptualized. Oops, sorry. Do you hear me? Because something happened in my computer.
Yes, yes, it's perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So the present becomes a transition and evolution to a hypothetical and ideal feature, and the past and the present of the migrant acquire value only in relationship to this ideal. For example, the refugee camps, the waiting zones, come to be designated as empty, wasted time, as stuck time, because in these places, the linear processes seem to be suspended. Or in the case of the rural migrants in cities, often in slums, or different other kinds of settlements, the focus is on the problem of their problematic now, which is again evaluated from the perspective of the hypothetical normative future. That becomes problematic from the perspective of the normative future. While in integrationist model, the transition is towards a normative feature, and they exist only in the problematic conditions of the now, there are some seemingly alternative frameworks of migration scholarship where the transition is assumed to be from an implicitly inscribed past, which could be seen as an enrichment, as an asset, as it is the case in the designation of post-migrant. I'm not going to get into this, where I talk about it in the article I sent you. In both perspectives, the temporality of the now, that is to say the contemporary, is situated and evaluated either in relation to a normative future or to an immutable past, no matter whether we evaluate it as an enrichment or a curse. Rather than situating the dynamics and relations of migrants within the contingency of time and place, shaped by the power geometry of the now, within a web of relations with others, these models employ either a past or a normative future fixated filtering of the sources of migrants' present practices and sociabilities. The temporal logic moves the analysis of migrants' agency and current practices away from the broader context of the dynamics and relations to the others in shaping the now. So you could see that where I try to excavate the dynamics of the now as an entry point. The next slide, please. Oh, I don't see it. Okay. Okay. This temporal repositioning of migrants' relations, memories, and sociabilities puts a priori closure to the complex, multiple, and changing ways people who are designated as migrants, refugees are positioned in time. Consequently, only particular kinds of historical past, mobilities, foundational cross-border mobilities, and social processes connected to these mobilities are highlighted in understanding current dynamics, practices, subjectivities, and sociabilities of the migrants. These selected processes are seen to be flowing into the now of migrants, but as discrepant temporalities shaping their agency. So the multiple sources of the self are acknowledged, which is good, but only as disjunct temporalities, as if they were an anomaly or as if they were only unique to the migrants and then the refugees. In this way, the spatio-temporal frames I referred to introduce an a priori divide to those who are designated as those with migrancy background and those without into temporal, different temporal predicaments. Migrant practices are approached on the one hand as if they were contemporaneous with the non-migrants, natives of the place, societies they are entangled with, and on the other hand, they are approached as if they were in perpetual transition, either from an inscribed and dependent past or towards a normative future. Anchoring refugees' frames of references in other times and spaces means that we categorically deny migrants to exist in the same now with the non-migrants. And I think this is a problem. Such a temporal framing hinders us from analyzing and seeing migrants' lives within the shared temporalities of the others, other residents, inhabitants of the places they are emplaced into. The consequence of situating migrants' frames of action and of reference into elsewhere and to other times, different from the natives' frame of action, is, in Fabian's words, a denial of covalness. That is, a denial of contemporaneity of migrants with the others. Most importantly, this is an asymmetry. Most importantly, this is not simply a conceptual problem, but a political issue. It has political consequences because such a framework obscures us to see the domains of commonality, their domains of commonality with the others, resulting from their subjection to common forces, though with unequal access to power and resources, and it reduces the hierarchies of the coloniality of power I referred before. The next slide, please. I'm almost finishing. Now, before concluding, I would like to walk you through the question of multiple temporalities of synchronicism and non-synchronicism. Because I think the multiple temporalities is not in itself a problem, but how we look at it. How could we take note of the multiple temporalities of migrants, refugees, without inscribing them into different fields of sociabilities, path dependencies, either as blatant or not yet there or not quite citizens? I think Bloch's notion of non-synchronism enables us to address the temporal discrepancies shaping migrants, refugees, subjectivities, and agency in their specificity. He uses the notion of non-synchronism to argue that, quote unquote, not all people live in the same now, thus not all contradictions and subjectivities of the now could be captured through an analysis of the contemporary political economic structure. So, because this is, you could say that not every, I mean, you can't be a presentist. Indeed, a perspective of non-synchronism is central to the chronotopes of the dominant frameworks of migrant scholarship, like the non-synchronicism of peasants in the city, who, according to Bloch, stand on a bad footing with today, within today, the now. Within the chronotopes of integration perspective, migrants lag behind in the now due to the remnants of their lives and habits anchored in spaces and times elsewhere. The next slide, please. However, I think this would be a very narrow reading of Bloch, as if he simply refers to the simultaneity of multiple and discrepant temporalities in the now, without addressing the dialectic between the synchronous and non-synchronous contradictions, say, shaping subjectivities and political lives. The power of not all people existing in the same now is not simply the power of simultaneity of multiple temporalities. He says, quote, having everything that is past in infinite polyphony, as it were, without a dominant voice, is mere historicism. The power geometry of the now, at the particular historical conjuncture, shapes the configuration and power of this dominant voice. And I think this is where the concept of historical conjuncture acquires importance. The non-synchronous and discrepant temporalities, the histories, the legacy of the histories, acquire different sources of the self, acquire presence and meaning, and are reconfigured in relation to the dominant voice of the historical conjuncture. Such a perspective urges us to recognize that no matter what kind of multiple temporalities we talk about, they are always configured through the power geometry and the regimes of value of the now, shaping the synchronity of the non-synchronous. This is a process coming to migrants as well as to those identified as non-migrants. Otherwise, I think we end up ripping our analysis of the dynamics of the displaced from the global dynamics shaped by the historical conjuncture of the now, and inscribe migrants and those identified as non-migrants forever into a world apart. Then we could start doing kind of bridging kind of activities and scholarship. Otherwise, I will conclude, I think, by saying that unless we remove the spatial and temporal blinders of migration scholarship, we remain prisoned within the multitude shades of methodological nationalism and the racializing logics of coloniality of power. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much. I took a little bit longer, but I lost, I was not able to see the slides. I don't know what happened. I was not able to see also my notes. Thank you very much. I think it was very, I chose to speak more in terms of conceptual terms, but in terms of examples from the empiricals that we could get into it in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Caglar, for very interesting and enriching lecture. Now I would like to open the floor for Q&A. You will see that you have a Q&A option, so you can write your questions or comments over there or in the chat, whatever is easier for you. And I will read the questions and comments to Professor Caglar. So any question, comment?
maybe I will take some questions just to play with with the possibility to ask the question to Professor Caglar, and maybe some others will be stimulated and ask a question. I know that it is always difficult to write a question, but it is different that because the narrative of writing and the narrative of speaking is so different. And I realize that. But in any case, I really appreciate your presentation and how close we are in the same line of thinking. I am myself thinking about trying to articulate the idea of thinking, Mediterranean thinking, and having also as I guess you have as object of a study how research is being done. Rather than migration directly, but how the research on migration is being done, and in my case, how the research on Mediterranean migration is being done. And then I found very stimulating all your conceptual effort in trying to analytically to disentangle assumption premises that maybe could obscure results and findings. This is something that comes from the very beginning of your thought, and then following this kind of logic, I have several questions. The first one is about how I will say how easy you put to displace mobility and take displacement. I really like justification. I think mobility, even I am now doing a book on concepts, and then Rainer Bobock is doing the concept of mobility. I take the concept of cohesion. Mobility, it makes a difference between mobility and migration, and he advised us to take into account to be care about these differences. And I see that you are in the same path, but and then the main reason that you take why mobility need to be put outside and take displacement is related to power, the power dimension of mobility, and I share that with you. But I wonder if in taking displacement instead of mobility, you are taking a real picture of the reality, but not the world reality of migration. Because displacement, of course, belongs to one reality of people that are forced to move in one way or another, and then there is some kind of subjectivity there, but also of power. But I realize that if we think in terms of a taxonomy of mobility, and then I will place displacement within this taxonomy, but I will not. I have difficulties to see how each other interact in your narrative, and I will take myself a position that maybe we have to take into account mobility is all-encompassing category that, and maybe to think about to do some kind of taxonomy of mobility. And within this taxonomy, of course, take into account displacements as one of the mobility taxonomy. And I would like to know more about that. I am sure you take that into account. I take the idea of taxonomy of mobility from a historical book about Mediterranean and mobility from a historical point of view. A book that tried to do this kind of taxonomy of maybe taking into account, for instance, a French people that go to Tunisia to live is a migrant, is doing mobility, but maybe not displacement in new terms. And then in this case, you are this category of displacement, even if I understand, make a problem because some other category of mobility, or are not included in. The same with the concept of emplacement. I see perfectly Foucault there behind. Of course, the small article of Foucault that I think it is a transcription of the radio interview that make a difference between emplacement and localization. And I take perfectly that displacement is related to power, and then you prefer emplacement instead of localization because emplacement is context related, and emplacement we can only understand localization when it is in relation to another localization, and then this is emplacement. Emplacement is that, and then in this case I will endorse that because I am myself taking into account that the way we can understand localization, a place, is always in relation to other places, and in this case, emplacement make sense of that. And then contextual basis, network basis, and relation, and so on. And from this point of view, I will not have objections of that. But in any case, I just wonder if we can take also the dimension of power within emplacement. That was, it seems to me, not visible in your one narrative. Taking into account that maybe, okay, you are speaking about temporality, and I agree with that. I am defending myself a philosophy of history in migration studies, because we really need historians, and we really need to try to identify what I call myself narrative hidden narratives within migration studies. And then from this point of view, the idea of temporality makes sense. But I just wonder why not to use the concept of history there, because block is there. My reference is block also, but my reference will be broader. This kind of different stance in history that overlaps in the now. What you say in the now? And if we take the cities, it is a good example of that. There are so many temporality in the cities. And then from this point of view, I will appreciate, but I just wonder this kind of philosophy of history will be also interesting. Of course, I have other comments, but I think for all the master students and others, this exercise of reflexivity of how research is being done is very important to do. And I think your one lecture is one example on how to do that and the benefits of doing that for running after research on migration. And then I appreciate particularly your lecture in the master studies, because this is a reflection that is needed for whatever students are doing a master. Thank you very much for that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ricard. Johan, am I allowed to respond immediately?
Yes, please go ahead. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank
you very much, Ricard. These are very good questions. I don't know I will be able to do justice to all of them, but I think in terms of your question about the taxonomy of mobility. But let me start from the last one. Actually, this is much more fresher in my mind. In terms of why am I not taking in terms of the philosophy, history, and the question of the multiple temporalities being active in the city? I think this is, of course, it is the migration scholarship, I think, suffers a lot with historical lack of historical consciousness and amnesia. And that is really a major issue in that. But how I could respond to you in the sense that in relation, I see your question, or the way I approach the questions that you raise is about the question about historical legacies. So, which kind of course, there are lots of histories, multiple temporalities are in operation. But what becomes as a kind of a legacy, having an effectivity and have an impact, is very much related with today's configuration of forces. And that is why historical conjuncture is a very important way to capture the looking at the histories and the taking out the legacies which are active on the current dynamics. And that is why I took the Bloch's code. It is not the historicism. And that is why this is multiple temporalities that are operating in the cities, but also with everyone's biographies. Narratives are not very different theoretically. There they are, the organizing point is very often, I mean, I will argue, always the entry point to understand the organization and what acquires a voice and what acquires an effectivity is very much related related to the forces active in the power geometry of the now, the contemporary. Otherwise, of course, we have all those kinds of legacies going on. I could give you, for example, for that, and an example from the border city that I was talking about. This city had very rich history, like many places, but because it was a crossroad on the Syrian and Turkish border, it is, in terms of the linguistically, it was a center of religious education and culturally a very rich place. And if you look at it, certain at the period between especially 80s and until 2000, of course you had these histories, but these histories had no effectivity or the voice in a particular way. So that historical conjuncture concept, that the now, enables us to what gets a voice in what configuration. So this is not negation of history, but against historicism. And I'm very much with you in terms of the emphasis on histories in migration scholarship. In terms of the emplacement and then the relation to power, of course, emplacement is like this localization as a relational concept. And emplacement is not only, as I say, that contrary to integration, that it is not only specific for one category of people. Everyone has to be emplaced somewhere. And I mean, it is a more general kind of a sociological concept. I think the empowerment is crucial to the question of power is crucial to the emplacement, because the nature of emplacement is given by the constraints and the opportunity structures, which are the product of a particular power structure of that period, of that time, of that space, and in time, in that particular time. So you cannot talk about the emplacement of anyone without, outside of those kinds of constraints and the opportunities, but they are not given simply by that locality. This is the multiscalarity comes into it. That locality, this is in terms of this like localization, the way those forces are unfolding in that locality, establishing the constraints and the opportunities. And those could not be talked outside of any kind of a power field. That is, so I mean, I think thank you very much to bringing this kind of distinction between emplacement and the localization and that relationality. In terms of the mobility, migration.
Sorry, it is not mine. It is Foucault. It is Foucault.
Yeah, I know, but I did not think about it.
Yeah.
No, I know, but I was not referring to it.
Yeah, no. I think you must take Foucault because it's very clear. It is
yes. So
Foucault make this distinction. It is in post-colonial studies. I use most of them.
Yeah. So
I will bring you that.
Okay, but I was not really thinking about that. But it is really it goes very well with it. So, in terms of the taxonomy of mobility, and why we are not taking the mobility as the umbrella topic. For me, the reason that then you have to go through, make so many taxonomies, and then afterwards, I'm really wondering what remains as an analytical value of that concept. Because, as you said, that the mobility, and we have seen that mobility studies, where did it go? I mean, it could go to everyone's. That of course, tourists are also mobile, and I have difficulties in terms of bringing the tourists and then the kind of the refugees. There might be some kinds of overlaps. People might come as tourists and overstay and that, but to understand their livelihood, I think it has to be connected to other kinds of processes. And mobility, for me, really focuses on the action, but not how that action is produced and connected to other dynamics. And you can do it, you can bring the forced migration as an undercategory of that. But as I said, that, and you were giving that there are people, there are literati, that is, for example, we know that from Europe, lots of people went to lived in Tangier, and then that is, I mean, how am I going to look at them as a kind of a same register of mobility with the ones that people who are from the other parts came of the country, came to Tangier from the rural and the urban rural migrants in Tangier. So it is related with the kind of some of the political stakes involved, I think. And I know that I will, I'm not sure, you're right, I'm not sure how the concept of displacement, for example, helps to understand the, even there I will say that it will help, that the expats, for example. But we know that expat category is also a very broad category and became a very fluid category. And it entails very different groups of people. not necessarily always with privileges, not necessarily always with kind of the companies and with high skilled and that. So even there, it would not help me to only look at it in terms of the mobility. I am very much concerned about the dynamics that produce that action and connect the actor, the subject, to those places. And this is to those dynamics in understanding the livelihood of those people. And this is not the dynamics that produce elsewhere, but also how they become emplaced is also part of those dynamics. So it is a, I know that this is not a completely satisfactory response to you, but I have the problem, as I said, if I take a taxonomy, it will go like all taxonomies, endlessly, and I wonder about the analytical value of that concept then afterwards.
Thank you very much, Professor Caglar. Someone else would like to make a question or comment? I have, if I may, I have a question, Professor Caglar. And to me, it's very interesting what you were referring before, this taxonomy. I mean, this well, the dichotomy between mobility and displacement. However, I'm thinking, I mean, when you present all this framework, to what extent, I don't know, I'm thinking of cities in the global south, to what extent they are incorporated into this idea of displacement. Because I mean, from my understanding, or from what I saw in the lecture, I don't know, I kept thinking about I mean, cities in the global north, or cities that are in maybe wealthier contexts. So I would like to hear more, how do you envision the situation? I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm originally from Colombia. In Colombia, cities are facing strong pressure from Venezuelan migrants, for instance, with little resources, with a lot of issues, with a lot of vulnerabilities overlapping from the local population, but also on the migrants. So all this idea, how this incorporates into this idea of placemaking, city making, but thinking in the global south.
Yeah. Okay, actually, I'm glad that you brought, thanks a lot, that you brought the Global South. And then I think the Global South is a better place to think of those dynamics of, not as mobilities, but also displacements. Because very often that the mobilities in the way mobility in migration scholarship in so-called global north taken is very much cross-border mobilities, which is thought to be as the defining characteristic of the making the migrants. But if you look at it, I mean, in the case that is, you have the Venezuelan migrants, but in the global south, it is very often the internally displaced people. And trying to capture them, or rural, urban, give the example for the cities. What characterizes is a very big, very often slums, informal settlements, and these are not necessarily cross-border mobilities. And very often within the mobility lands of migration scholarship, they are categorized and their dynamics are looked at under different, from a different perspective. And there, I think displacement, particularly for global south, where you have those migrations substantially within the nation space is very important, and they might not be seen as migrants. They might be seen as they are made worthless on very different criteria, not being cultureless, uncivilized, or racial hierarchies that operating with. But there, I think I see the displacement much more relevant than, or much more clearly than I would see in global north.
Great, thank you very much.
Yes.
Questions? Do you have?
I think no one wants to ask a question.
Yes. I don't know, Ricardo, you want to add?
Maybe I would not, just because I just realized that I forget one question that was I think it's important, at least for me, it's important. It is the concept of value regimes that you are using. I think it's very good, yeah? And really I appreciate these, I will say this innovative category of value regimes, because I think it allows us to encapsulate not only thinking in Mediterranean, south and north, east and west, and so on, because there are different value regimes to understand the same realities, but also within the same Europe, there are many value regimes on how to understand policy making on and governance on migration. I am thinking not only this kind of multi-scale approach, that means also that maybe cities are different approaches for the phenomenon of governance of migration than states, but also NGOs that also are through their practice, they are also expressing different value regimes in the STEM. I don't know if I am using correctly this concept of value regimes, but I found it analytically, in this case, I found it very fruitful, because it allows us to encapsulate within the same category different realities. But I just wonder if I am using it correctly or not, just to challenge you in your own category of value regimes, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, you refer to value regimes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, I refer to the value regimes, actually both valorization and devalorization. Devaluation and revaluation. So valorization, devaluation, and then to look at it, saying that that is very much related to the, in general, how value is created for the cities that, for example, that we are talking about. So it is not, I am not sure what you refer to is what I am referring to, because it is not about moral economies. In terms of different kinds of different values, the different groups have very different value regimes. But I'm trying to understand how different sites, different groups, in the eyes of various actors, acquire value and lose value. And how am I going to understand these processes? And that's why I gave the example, and I will come back to the NGOs that you are referring to. I will come back to the example that I said that sometimes they, yes, the demonized group might become a kind of an asset, depending on the geopolitics, depending on also the conjuncture, but and they might what needs to be differentiated, and your question directs me to that, is the actors, in whose eyes. And I think with the NGOs, that your question was also somehow related, because you might have a value in the eyes of global institutions, or by the NGOs, or local institutions, but local actors, but not in the eyes of the state. You might not have that kind of the valorization. So it is not a kind of a homogenized way. I could give you the example, for example, and two examples I could give you. In the place that, in the city that where these Syriac Christians, they have nothing to do with the Syrian refugees. This was a minority, Syriac Christians, and who had to leave, who had to flee the place, because they were subject to first in the genocide, and then they really had to flee. And then they came back as the returnees, and by the forces actually who were killing them, and who invited them again back. So, but they became a value in the eyes of the local authorities, and then later in the eyes of the state, because they acquired the value as a persecuted minority, religious minority in supranational actors and global actors in vis-a-vis to Catholic Church and what was happening in the Middle East. So there were, it is not a I'm not talking about a kind of a unified value regime. So it is a very dynamic one, but one could only understand in terms of through a multiscalar analysis. And in terms of the, again, for the becoming an asset, in Manchester, New Hampshire, in the city, that we knew that partly refugees become a desired group to accommodate, to lodge them in the rundown downtown, because they became part of the category of the disadvantaged. The policies about disadvantagedness helped to have them a value in the eyes of urban planners and real estate developers, not urban planners, real estate developers. So they were very much attracted and provided place, which would not have happened otherwise, to be able to access certain resources. So they became a value in relation to something. Maybe that explains that we have seen also in Halle, where the from the refugees or migrants who were lodged in the downtown to store actually value of the rundown places. But then afterwards, when they were getting some money in terms of for renovations, and they were displaced to a very different kind of a neighborhood. But then within that neighborhood, together with the urban poor, together with the people, they became part of the disadvantage to access services. So even that disadvantagedness category not only connected them to the others, and of course connected, but also created tensions. Some kinds of, I mean, there are commonalities, but in terms of the precarities, but nevertheless, that there was those kind of anti-migrant sentiments within the that group of people, but that allowed them to have access to certain kinds of services, no matter how ridiculous those services were, but it became a venue for that. So maybe these explain what I understand from those kind of value regimes. There it is really a field of conflict, and it is very dynamic in that sense.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Caglar, for answering our questions. I think that we don't have more comments or questions. So would you like to add something, Professor Caglar?
No.
No, okay. Because I saw that you don't mute it. Okay.
No,
so
no, I was just looking. Something is wrong with my computer, so that is really.
Oh, well, we hope you can fix it because now with the teleworking is essential. So again, thank you very much for giving us this wonderful lecture. Thank you to everyone for their participation in this session, and we hope to see you in future events organized by GRITIM. Have a nice afternoon and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Just to remind you that Professor Caglar allow us to record the lecture, and then the lecture will be edited and then distributed and to all the audience and beyond. Thank you for that, for allowing us to record the session.